Once again, the Queen of Consorts surprises us, but not in a good way.
Made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia.
10 o'clock in the morning on June 26, 2024. The air inside room 1844 at Buckingham Palace is thick, with a silence that feels like a physical weight. King Charles III stands by the heavy mahogany desk, his hands trembling as he holds a single sheet of paper that was never meant for his eyes. This is not just a clerical error or a simple leak. This is a calculated betrayal written in black and white, originating from the very heart of the Queen's office at Clarence House. The king stares at the document, realizing that the woman he has loved and trusted for decades has been operating a shadow administration right under his nose. The document reveals a shocking breach of protocol. Queen Camilla's office had secretly contacted the Charity Commission to initiate the transfer of 30% of major royal patronages. These are not minor titles. They are the pillars of the monarchy's influence. According to the long-standing generational transition plan, these patronages were strictly destined for Catherine, the Princess of Wales. Instead, the paperwork shows a clandestine effort to divert control to Camilla's personal allies and members of her own private family. The king is forced to face a devastating reality. While the world sees a united front, a secret war for legacy is being waged within the palace walls. As the king processed the weight of the discovery, he reportedly summoned his closest aide, his voice a low, jagged whisper of disbelief. He questioned how such a massive move could be orchestrated without a single signature from the sovereign. He asked, with a bitterness he had never shown before, if his authority had become so invisible that his own wife felt the need to build a fortress against his own heirs. The betrayal feels personal because it targets Catherine, who is currently the most beloved and yet the most vulnerable member of the royal family. If you are captivated by these hidden corridors of power, make sure to hit the like button and leave a comment below telling us what you think about this royal rift. To stay updated on every twist and turn, please subscribe to our channel, Palace Tea Tonight. Just a quick reminder as you join our community, this narrative is a work of fiction intended for your entertainment. By subscribing, you ensure you never miss a moment of the drama we craft here at Palace Tea Tonight. The tension escalated when the Queen was finally confronted later that morning. The narrative of their encounter describes a king who felt like a stranger in his own home. He looked at her and demanded to know why she felt the need to carve out a kingdom of her own at the expense of his daughter-in-law. The Queen's response, relayed through hushed palace whispers, was not one of apology, but of cold survival. She reportedly told him that she would not be left a widow with no ground to stand on, and that she was merely securing her future in a palace that has always been a den of lions. This was the moment Charles realized that Camilla's fear of isolation after his reign had driven her to build a chessboard of power. She wasn't just protecting herself, she was actively dismantling the future he had spent years planning for William and Catherine. The realization that 30% of the crown's charitable influence could be redirected to private interests left the king feeling hollow. At 10:30 in the morning, just 30 minutes after finding the file, the king ordered a total lockdown on all outgoing correspondence from Clarence House. The rift is no longer a private matter. It is a constitutional crisis hidden behind the gold-leaf doors of room 1844. The trust that held the new Carolean era together has just been shattered, and the fallout is only beginning. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the 14th of July, 2024, the Oak Room at Windsor Castle, a space defined by its heavy timber walls and centuries of whispered secrets, became the setting for the most significant internal challenge to the British monarchy in decades. This was no longer a matter of administrative errors. It was an emergency family council. The atmosphere was described by those present as suffocatingly tense, as the senior members of the House of Windsor gathered to address a breach of trust that threatened to destabilize the very foundation of the crown. Princess Anne, known for her sharp mind and unwavering dedication to the institution, led the charge. She stood before the king and the gathered council, placing a series of audited financial reports from the sovereign grant on the table. The numbers were staggering and undeniable. She revealed that staff members within Queen Camilla's office had quietly redirected £1,500,000 from the royal contingency budget. This vast sum had not gone to charity or public service, but had been funneled into bolstering the Queen's private media offices, essentially creating a sophisticated public relations machine designed to operate independently of the central palace structure. The Princess Royal was reported to have looked directly at the king, her voice steady but cold, as she stated that the paper trail did not lie. She warned the room that a shadow government was being funded by the taxpayers' money, one that seemed focused on personal image over the collective stability of the monarchy. The revelation sent a shockwave through the room, but it was Prince William's reaction that shifted the tone from a financial dispute to a constitutional crisis. The Prince of Wales, moved by a protective instinct forged in the fires of his youth, refused to remain a passive observer. For William, this was not just about money. It was about the protection of his wife and the integrity of his future reign. He was heard to tell the council, with a decisiveness that surprised many, that the mistakes of 1996 would not be repeated. He was referring to the isolation and media manipulation his late mother, Diana, had endured. William made it clear that he would not allow Catherine to be marginalized by a private media office looking to secure its own power. William's demand was unprecedented. He called for the activation of a revised Regency Act. He argued that should the king's health require a transition of power, Camilla's authority must be frozen to prevent any further unauthorized maneuvers. He reportedly told his father that the crown's future was not a negotiable asset and that the line of succession must be protected from internal sabotage. He was not just a son speaking to a father, he was a future king asserting his authority to safeguard the woman who would one day be queen. Throughout this storm, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, remained a figure of silent, powerful dignity. She did not speak, but her presence was the focal point of the entire conflict. Internally, she was reportedly torn. She has spent years preparing for the weight of the crown, but the realization that she had become the target of a sophisticated internal power play was a bitter pill to swallow. She sat with a composure that masked a deep sense of insecurity about the very people she was supposed to trust. As the meeting in the Oak Room concluded, no easy resolution was found. The king was left caught between his devotion to his wife and his duty to his heir. The lines have been drawn, and the financial evidence provided by Princess Anne has turned a family disagreement into a cold war of ledgers and laws. The question now hanging over Windsor is no longer if there is a rift, but how much more will be sacrificed to keep the secrets of the Oak Room from tearing the monarchy apart. 1600 hours. The king's private study. Behind a door that had been locked to even the most trusted aides, the final act of this royal drama was playing out. The atmosphere inside was not one of shouting or rage, but of a devastating, cold clarity. King Charles III sat behind his mahogany desk, looking not at a monarch's consort, but at the woman who had been the center of his world for over 40 years. On the desk between them lay a single, heavy document, a formal declaration of resignation from all public roles and royal patronages. This was the ultimatum that no one in the palace thought Charles would ever have the heart to deliver. The king spoke in a voice that was reportedly thick with a sorrow that transcended politics. He presented Camilla with a choice that echoed the darkest days of the monarchy's past. Either she would sign the document, effectively withdrawing into a quiet, private life away from the levers of power, or he would be forced to take unprecedented constitutional action. This action would involve the public removal of her titles and status, a move that had not been seen with such severity since the aftermath of the 1996 divorce of the late Princess Diana. The king was recorded as saying to his wife that while his heart belonged to her, his soul and his life belonged to the crown. He explained that he could not allow the foundation of the House of Windsor to be eroded by side deals and secret alliances, even if those alliances were built out of a fear for her own future. He looked at her with the eyes of a man forced to choose between the only love he had ever truly known and the survival of a 1,000-year-old institution. To Charles, the stability of the monarchy and the smooth transition to William and Catherine were non-negotiable, even if it meant the end of the partnership that had defined his adult life. Camilla's reaction was described as one of absolute, paralyzing shock. For decades, she had been the king's closest confidant, the one person who understood the weight he carried. She had believed that their shared history, their 40 years of enduring public scrutiny and private struggle, had made her untouchable within the palace walls. But as she looked at the document on the mahogany desk, the realization finally set in. In the cold mathematics of the British monarchy, the crown always wins. She realized that even 40 years of devotion could not stand against the necessity of the royal bloodline. The king's silence was his most powerful weapon. He did not need to raise his voice to convey the finality of the moment. He was a man who had spent his entire life waiting for the throne, only to find that the greatest threat to his legacy was sitting across from him. He told her that he had to protect Catherine's future, for in doing so, He was protecting the future of the kingdom itself. He was acting not out of spite, but out of a desperate, painful duty to ensure that the mistakes of the past were never repeated. As the clock in the study ticked toward the evening hours, the weight of the decision hung in the air. The woman who had fought so hard to be accepted by the British public and the royal family now faced the prospect of being erased from the institution she had worked so tirelessly to join. The doors to the study remained locked, leaving the rest of the palace to wonder if the Queen would choose a quiet exit or if the monarchy was about to enter a public battle that would change the face of the Windsor dynasty forever. The silence from within the room was deafening, leaving the future of the throne hanging by a single thread. 17:30 in the afternoon. The sun began its slow descent behind the stone parapets of Buckingham Palace, casting long skeletal shadows across the West Wing. In the world of high diplomacy and ancient tradition, timing is everything, and this was the hour of the sunset decree. As the golden light faded, the heavy silence of the West Wing was broken by the rhythmic clicking of heels and the sharp, official sound of wax seals being pressed onto door frames. The constitutional secretary had arrived, and he was not there for a social visit. Under the direct authority of the king, the constitutional secretary began the systematic dismantling of Queen Camilla's administrative empire. In a move that sent shockwaves through the royal household, the Queen's private offices were officially declared closed for investigation. The speed of the operation was surgical. Within a window of just 2 hours, 14 senior staff members, the very architects of Camilla's private influence, were either reassigned to distant provincial duties or had their contracts terminated immediately. These were men and women who had spent years navigating the corridors of power on her behalf, now reduced to handing over their security badges and encrypted devices under the watchful eyes of palace security. The financial blow was just as devastating. The king's decree included a mandate that slashed the Queen's personal operating budget by 45%, effective immediately. This was a clinical extraction of power, designed to ensure that no shadow government could ever operate within the palace again. The redirected funds were reportedly moved back into the Sovereign Grants General Reserve, a clear signal that the era of private spheres of influence was over. While the administrative machinery was being torn down, a far more poignant scene was unfolding within the Queen's private suite. Camilla stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by a growing number of cardboard archive boxes. The grand furniture, which had once hosted the most powerful figures in British society, was now covered in protective sheets. When a junior aide tentatively entered the room to offer assistance with her personal effects, the Queen reportedly refused with a sharp wave of her hand. She wanted no witnesses to this moment of absolute vulnerability. Witnesses from the hallway recount a chilling sight through the half-open door. The Queen, a woman who had endured decades of public vilification to finally reach the side of the man she loved, stood before a tall mirror. With trembling fingers, she reached up and unpinned her royal brooch, a symbol of her status and her union with the king. She placed it slowly onto a bare mahogany table, her eyes fixed on the cold metal. This was the pride of a woman who had survived the scandals of the 1990s, the vitriol of the press, and the cold shoulder of the establishment, only to find her legacy dismantled by a few strokes of her husband's pen. The king had chosen the survival of the Windsor dynasty over the comfort of his wife, and the weight of that choice was now visible in every box being taped shut. As the final staff members were escorted from the West Wing, the Queen remained in the darkening room, a solitary figure amidst the wreckage of her ambitions. The silence in the West Wing was no longer the silence of respect, but the silence of an ending. The sun had set on more than just the day. It had set on the power structure Camilla had spent a lifetime building. But as the palace lights flickered on, a new question began to circulate through the whispered conversations of the household. In the wake of such a brutal purge, what becomes of a marriage that was supposed to be the bedrock of a reign? 6 o'clock in the morning. The small garden room at Buckingham Palace was filled with a pale, cold light that offered no warmth to the two people sitting inside. There were no private secretaries, no constitutional advisors, and no security details within earshot. This was the first time in 48 hours that King Charles III and Queen Camilla were truly alone. The grandeur of the previous day's sunset decree had left them both looking older, their faces etched with the exhaustion of a night spent in separate wings of the palace. The king sat across from his wife, not as a monarch presiding over a council, but as a man seeking a way to live with the consequences of his own commands. On the small table between them sat a single sheet of paper, the Dawn Accord. It was a private agreement, a roadmap for a future that looked nothing like the one they had envisioned during their decades of waiting for the throne. The terms were absolute and final. Camilla would be allowed to retain a protected private residence at Ray Mill House, her long-cherished country home. This would be her sanctuary, a place where she could exist away from the suffocating scrutiny of the palace and the watchful eyes of the king's accountants. However, the price of this sanctuary was her total withdrawal from the levers of state. The king was recorded as stating, in a low and steady voice, that the days of her office influencing policy or patronage were over. Under this new agreement, the queen would no longer attend legislative events or have any say in the administrative transition of the crown to the next generation. She was, in essence, being moved into a constitutional retirement present for the ceremonial surface of the monarchy, but completely erased from its inner workings. As the sun climbed higher, the internal reality of their situation became painfully clear. They looked at each other through a lens of profound breakage. For 40 years, they had been a team, a joint dynasty that had fought against the world to be together. Now that shared ambition lay in ruins. They were two people at the sunset of their lives, realizing that while they had saved their marriage on a personal level, they had been forced to execute the professional partnership that had defined them. The queen was heard to ask, with a quiet bitterness, if this was what they had spent a lifetime fighting for. The king's response was a reflection of his ultimate burden. He reportedly told her that they could remain husband and wife in the quiet moments of the evening, but as of 6 o'clock that morning, the king and queen as a political unit had ceased to exist. He had chosen to protect the line of succession and the future of Catherine and William, even if it meant living a separate life behind closed doors. The Dawn Accord was a peace treaty signed in the shadow of a Cold War. It allowed them to avoid the scandal of a formal separation, but it signaled the end of Camilla's influence within the House of Windsor. As they walked out of the small garden room, they were no longer the power couple that had ascended to the throne together. They were two individuals bound by a crown that had finally come between them. The question that now haunts the halls of Buckingham Palace is how long a marriage can survive when the trust that built it has been traded for the survival of a kingdom. Can the king and his consort ever truly return to the way they were? Or has the 1844 room claimed one final irreparable victim? 11 o'clock in the morning. The ancient bells of Westminster Abbey rang out across London, a sound that has signaled both the triumphs and the tragedies of the British monarchy for nearly 1,000 years. On this day, millions of people around the world were tuned in, watching a grand ceremonial procession that appeared, on the surface, to be a display of perfect unity and tradition. But behind the polished metals and the heavy silk of the royal robes, a new order had been established, one born from the wreckage of the secret documents found in the 1844 room. As the heavy oak doors of the abbey swung open, the figure of King Charles III emerged. In a departure from recent tradition, the king walked at the head of the procession alone. This solitary march was the public manifestation of the Dawn Accord. No longer flanked by a consort who shared his administrative burdens, the king moved with a heavy, singular authority. His expression was a mask of stoic duty, revealing nothing of the personal heartbreak or the exhaustion of the secret hearings that had taken place behind locked doors only hours before. Following closely behind was Catherine, the Princess of Wales. She moved with a grace that has become her trademark, but there was a new, ironclad resolve in her eyes. Today, she stepped into her role as the highest-ranking princess of the realm, officially assuming the stewardship of the major royal patronages that had been the subject of the secret palace war. The transition was seamless to the casual observer, yet to those within the royal household, it was the final confirmation of a victory. Catherine was no longer just the future queen, she had become the central pillar of the monarchy's current stability, the direct beneficiary of the king's decision to prioritize the bloodline over his own marital partnership. Beside her, Prince William walked with a grim, unwavering focus. There were no triumphant smiles, no nods of victory to the cameras. The Prince and Princess of Wales presented a front of cold solemnity that sent a chillingly clear message to the nation and the world. In the world of the High Windsors, the price of stability is often paid in the currency of ruthlessness. They were not there to celebrate a win, they were there to honor a sacrifice. They understood that the unity of the crown had been preserved only by dismantling the influence of a woman who had been part of their father's life for 4 decades. The atmosphere inside the abbey was thick with the weight of this new reality. The silent dynasty had taken hold. The king's solitary position and Catherine's elevated status marked the end of the experimental shared power structure that had threatened to split the palace in two. The lesson of the 1844 room was etched into every step of the procession. The institution is greater than the individual, and the crown will always protect its own future, no matter how high the personal cost. As the ceremony concluded, the royal family vanished back into the shadows of the palace, leaving the public to wonder what other secrets were being buried in the name of the throne. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the hidden corridors of power. If you found this exploration of the silent Cold War within the palace intriguing, please hit the like button and subscribe to Palace Tea Tonight for more behind-the-scenes insights. We want to know your thoughts. Did the king make the right choice for the future of the monarchy? Leave a comment below and join the conversation. Please note, the events, dialogues, and internal motivations depicted in this series are a narrative dramatization based on ongoing reports, historical precedents, and royal speculation. This is a creative interpretation of the complex dynamics within the House of Windsor and should be viewed as a narrative exploration rather than a strictly factual news report. Stay tuned as we continue to watch the unfolding drama of the world's most famous family.